On the 17th of October, 2018, in a dust-hazed afternoon in the old city of Damascus, a woman known as Alia Sadiq applied a solution of isopropanol and deionized water to the frayed edge of a 14th-century Mamluk textile. Her studio, located on the second floor of a stone building that had survived centuries of conflict, smelled of parchment dust, linseed oil, and the faint, acidic tang of chemical fixatives. To any observer peering through the grime-streaked window, she was the picture of academic dedication. Her dark hair was tied back severely, her concentration absolute, her movements with the cotton swab precise and economical. Yet, the tools arranged on her workbench told a more complex story than that of a simple art restorer. Beside the jars of organic solvents and natural pigments lay a set of dental picks machined from a non-magnetic titanium alloy, a series of brushes whose hollow handles could store microSD cards, and a digital loop whose internal electronics were modified to double as a wide-spectrum signals detector. Alia Sadiq was a legend, a meticulously constructed fiction given life and purpose by the Israeli intelligence service, Mossad, and the woman inhabiting this identity, whose real name was known to only 3 people in the world, was the surgical instrument for an operation of unprecedented subtlety and risk. Her true work had nothing to do with preserving the past, but with invisibly altering the future by dismantling Syria's most dangerous secret. The strategic problem facing the Mossad's Tzamit division, responsible for recruiting and running agents, had become acute in the years following the partial dismantling of Syria's chemical weapons arsenal under international pressure. While the world's attention had been focused on the declared stockpiles of sarin and VX gas, a far more insidious program had reconstituted itself within the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the Scientific Studies and Research Center, the SSRC. Unit 4000, a clandestine subdivision of the SSRC, was tasked with developing a new generation of chemical agents that circumvented the chemical signatures monitored by the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. Intelligence, gathered through a painful and costly combination of signals intelligence intercepts and low-level human sources, pointed to the creation of a novel binary nerve agent. Unlike traditional agents, which were stored in their active, lethal form, a binary weapon contained 2 relatively stable and individually non-lethal precursor chemicals. Only when mixed, typically within the munition just before deployment, did they react to form the final, hypertoxic compound. This new Syrian agent, designated internally as Common 7 or Cumin 7, was designed to produce a nerve agent with a unique molecular structure, one that would not be identifiable by existing detection equipment and for which Western militaries had no standardized antidote protocol. The precursors themselves were engineered to mimic the chemical profiles of industrial fertilizers and pesticides, allowing for their production and transport under the guise of legitimate agricultural or industrial activity, a critical deception in a country under constant satellite surveillance. Previous attempts to halt the program through conventional means had met with catastrophic failure. A 2017 airstrike on a suspected SSRC research facility in Masyaf had successfully destroyed the target building, but intelligence later confirmed that the core research team and their most critical data had been relocated weeks prior, suggesting a leak within the intelligence gathering chain. The strike had only served to make the program's leadership more paranoid and its security protocols more draconian. Electronic surveillance became increasingly difficult as Unit 4000 adopted antiquated but effective methods of communication, including hand-couriered messages and face-to-face meetings in electronically swept locations, rendering many of the National Security Agency and Unit 8200's most sophisticated tools useless. The human intelligence network within Syria, already degraded by years of brutal civil war and counterintelligence purges, could provide only fragmented, low-resolution snapshots of the program. They could confirm the existence of Common 7 and identify some of the junior chemists involved, but they could not penetrate the inner sanctum or provide the specific chemical formulas and production methodologies required for a targeted disruption. The stakes were impossibly high. The successful development of Common 7 would not only give the Assad regime an undetectable weapon of mass destruction but also create a new and terrifyingly accessible tool for its proxies, Hezbollah and other militant groups, fundamentally altering the strategic balance of power in the Levant and placing Israeli civilian centers under an existential threat that air defense systems could not counter. A new approach was required, one that moved beyond explosions and assassinations to a level of infiltration that bordered on the impossible. The central pillar of the Common 7 program, and therefore the primary operational target, was Major General Adnan al-Hamid. Al-Hamid was not a typical military officer, he was a preeminent chemical engineer, holding a doctorate from a prestigious German university, and was regarded by his peers as a man of formidable, almost monomaniacal intellect. His psychological profile, compiled by the Mossad's research division from debriefings of defectors, academic colleagues, and distant family members, painted a picture of a man defined by a potent mixture of brilliance, arrogance, and deep-seated paranoia. He viewed his work not merely as a military directive but as a patriotic and scientific crusade to grant Syria strategic invincibility. He trusted no one, not even his own senior staff, personally overseeing every critical stage of the agent's synthesis and stabilization. His personal security was an extension of this paranoia. He varied his routes to work daily, his homes and offices were subjected to constant counter-surveillance sweeps, and he eschewed digital communication for all sensitive matters, relying instead on a series of leather-bound notebooks filled with his own unique chemical shorthand. He was, by all accounts, an impenetrable fortress, a man whose entire life was structured to prevent the very kind of penetration Mossad sought. However, the profile also identified a single, exploitable vulnerability, a singular passion that existed outside his hermetically sealed world of chemical compounds and security protocols, a deep and scholarly love for Islamic and Levantine antiquities, specifically rare manuscripts and textiles. It was a passion he pursued with the same obsessive focus he applied to his scientific work, and it was through this narrow aperture that Mossad planned to insert its scalpel. The operational plan conceived within the Caesarea Department, Mossad's Special Operations Unit, was codenamed Operation Damask Rose. It was a plan of audacious patience and subtlety, a stark departure from the unit's more kinetic reputation. The objective was not to eliminate General al-Hamid, as his death would only martyr him and allow a successor to continue his work with the existing research. The objective was to discredit him and his work so thoroughly from within that the entire Common 7 program would collapse under the weight of its own perceived failure. The method would be sabotage, but not of the conventional variety. There would be no explosives, no overt destruction of facilities. The plan called for the introduction of a custom-synthesized catalytic contaminant into the Common 7 production cycle. This contaminant, developed by Mossad's own chemists in collaboration with specialists at the Israel Institute for Biological Research, was a masterpiece of malicious chemistry. It was a complex organometallic compound designed to bond with the specific stabilizing agent used in one of the binary precursors. Once introduced, it would remain dormant for a period of 3 to 6 months, its effect masked by the normal chemical processes. Then, accelerated by ambient temperature fluctuations, it would begin to rapidly degrade the stabilizer. The result would be twofold: some batches of the precursor would become completely inert, rendering the final agent useless, while other batches, depending on the concentration of the contaminant, would become highly unstable, leading to unpredictable and potentially violent reactions during the mixing process. The beauty of the solution was its plausible deniability. The failures would appear to be the result of a fundamental flaw in al-Hamid's own formula, a catastrophic scientific miscalculation. The subsequent investigation by Syrian counterintelligence would find no evidence of sabotage, only the apparent incompetence of a once brilliant scientist. The primary obstacle was delivery. The contaminant had to be introduced directly into the research and development phase, a process overseen personally by al-Hamid in his most secure laboratory. This required an asset who could get physically close to the general, not just once, but repeatedly, in a context that would not arouse suspicion. The asset needed a cover identity so robust, so deeply and authentically layered, that it could withstand not only initial scrutiny but the sustained pressure of a long-term relationship with a profoundly paranoid target. The technical, linguistic, and cultural barriers were immense. The operative would need to be a fluent, native-level speaker of the specific Damascene dialect of Arabic, possess a world-class, demonstrable expertise in a field that would attract al-Hamid's interest, and have the psychological resilience to live a life for years, completely isolated, with no possibility of immediate extraction if compromised. The risks were absolute. If the operative's cover was broken, it would not only mean their certain torture and execution but would also expose the depth of Israeli intelligence penetration, triggering a diplomatic crisis and potentially escalating regional tensions to the point of open conflict. Failure was not an option, but the path to success was a thread stretched over a chasm. The technological and tactical preparation for Operation Damask Rose was a multi-year, multi-departmental endeavor that pushed the boundaries of intelligence tradecraft. The sabotage agent itself, designated Mantis, was the primary focus. Chemists worked for over 18 months to perfect its characteristics. It needed to be colorless, odorless, and stable in a carrier solution that could be deployed without specialized equipment. Critically, it had to have a delayed, or long-tail, activation period, ensuring that by the time its effects manifested, the moment of introduction would be buried deep in the past, beyond the scope of any reasonable investigation. The final formulation was suspended in a volatile, quick-drying solvent that left behind no detectable residue. The delivery system was equally ingenious. Rather than a syringe or a vial, which would be impossible to conceal, the technical specialists in the Neviat division designed a microaerosolizer, a device no larger than a lipstick tube, that could be seamlessly integrated into the handle of a professional-grade airbrush, a common tool used in textile restoration for applying fine layers of fixative. The device used compressed nitrogen to expel a single, precisely measured dose of the Mantis compound in a fine, invisible mist. The nozzle was engineered to create a specific plume geometry, allowing the operative to contaminate a target surface, a document, a piece of clothing, a briefcase handle, from a distance of up to 2 feet with near-perfect accuracy, leaving no splashback or peripheral contamination. The entire apparatus was designed to be used and then disposed of, its components made from materials that would degrade rapidly in common household chemicals. The selection of the operative was the most critical element of the entire plan. The search, led by a senior psychologist and a veteran Katza from Summit, sifted through the files of hundreds of potential candidates. They were not looking for a soldier or a typical field agent. They needed someone with a rare combination of scientific acumen, artistic sensibility, and what they termed deep psychological endurance. They found her in Yael Kaplan, a 32-year-old chemist working in the Antiquities Division of the Israel Museum. Yael was brilliant, holding a master's degree in organic chemistry, but her life had been shaped by a tragedy that Mossad's profilers identified as a powerful, if dormant, motivational driver. Her younger brother had been killed a decade earlier in a bus bombing in Jerusalem, an attack carried out by a proxy group funded and armed by Syria. Her grief had not manifested as overt anger or nationalism but as a quiet, intense, and methodical dedication to her work, a desire to preserve and restore order to things that had been broken. She was fluent in Arabic, having grown up in a mixed neighborhood, and possessed a natural talent for fine art restoration. Psychologically, she scored exceptionally high on tests measuring patience, compartmentalization, and emotional regulation. She was the perfect raw material. The recruitment process was slow and indirect. She was initially approached under the guise of consulting for a defense contractor on the chemical composition of ancient dyes, a project that gradually introduced her to intelligence personnel posing as corporate researchers. Over 6 months, she was drawn deeper in, her patriotism and the memory of her brother subtly leveraged until the true nature of the work was revealed. Her decision to accept, when it came, was not born of jingoism, but of a cold, calculated desire to prevent others from suffering the same loss she had. Yael's transformation from civilian chemist to deep-cover operative was a 2-year process of systematic deconstruction and reconstruction of her identity. Her training at the Midrasha, Mossad's elite training academy, went far beyond the standard curriculum. While she mastered the essentials of tradecraft, dead drops, brush passes, surveillance detection routes, and encrypted burst communications, her primary focus was on legend immersion. She spent 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, living as Alia Sadiq. She was tutored by a retired art restorer, one of the world's foremost experts on Islamic textiles, until her skills were not just proficient but truly world-class. She learned to identify the weaving patterns of different dynasties, the chemical composition of dyes from specific historical periods, and the delicate techniques for repairing centuries-old silk and linen. Simultaneously, she worked with dialect coaches to erase any trace of her Israeli accent and adopt the precise cadence and vocabulary of a wealthy, educated Damascene Christian. Her psychological conditioning was the most grueling component. Through a series of punishingly realistic simulations, she was trained to withstand interrogation, to control her physiological responses under extreme stress, and, most importantly, to suppress her original identity so completely that Alia Siddiq became her default persona. She learned to think in Alia's language, to react with Alia's memories, and to feel Alia's emotions. It was a process of controlled psychological fragmentation designed to create a cover so perfect it would fool not only the target but the operative herself. The construction of Alia Siddiq's backstory was a masterpiece of intelligence artisanship, an operation in itself that involved dozens of Mossad personnel across multiple departments. Alia was to be a third-generation Syrian expatriate, born and raised in Buenos Aires, a city with a large and well-established Syrian diaspora. This provided a plausible reason for any minor imperfections in her accent and cultural knowledge. A team in Argentina was tasked with building her legend on the ground. They created a birth certificate, baptismal records from a real Maronite church, and school records. They rented an apartment in her name for several years, creating a history of utility bills and rental payments. They opened and maintained a bank account, establishing a legitimate financial footprint. A separate team built her digital ghost. Social media profiles were created and aged over 5 years, populated with photos of a lookalike in Buenos Aires, posts about art restoration, and mundane interactions with a network of unwitting friends and Mossad-controlled accounts. Her professional reputation was built with equal care. A website was launched showcasing her portfolio, containing high-resolution images of real restoration projects, with permissions secretly obtained. She was listed as a contributor in the catalogs of several minor art auctions, and articles praising her work were planted in niche art history journals. By the time the legend was complete, Alia Siddiq was a real person in every verifiable metric. She had a past, a profession, a digital footprint, and a network of acquaintances who could, if asked, confirm her existence. This was the armor Yael would wear into one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Alia Siddiq's insertion into Syria in late 2016 was deliberately quiet and bureaucratic. She did not slip across a border in the dead of night. She arrived at Damascus International Airport on a commercial flight from Beirut, holding a legitimate Syrian passport issued through a consulate that had been compromised by a Mossad asset. Her stated purpose was to establish a specialized studio to help preserve the nation's cultural heritage, a narrative that played well with the regime's efforts to project an image of stability and cultural stewardship amidst the chaos of the civil war. She used her substantial, and Mossad provided, personal funds to lease and renovate a workspace in the Old City, a location chosen for its dense, labyrinthine layout which offered natural advantages for counter-surveillance. The first 2 years of the operation were a study in methodical patience. Alia focused exclusively on building her cover. She made no attempt to contact General al-Hamid or anyone connected to the SSRC. Instead, she poured her energy into her work, taking on commissions from wealthy Damascene merchants, government officials, and religious institutions. She worked meticulously, charged high prices, and delivered results that were nothing short of brilliant. Her reputation grew organically through word of mouth within the city's small, insular elite. She hosted small, private showings in her studio, cultivating an air of artistic exclusivity. She was polite but reserved, a professional woman focused on her craft, a persona that was non-threatening and engendered trust. During this entire period, her only communication with her handler was through a series of asynchronous dead drops, using encrypted messages concealed within the digital metadata of seemingly innocuous photographs of her restoration work, which she would upload to a private cloud storage account. The moment for initiating contact with the target was chosen with surgical precision. Mossad's intelligence network learned that General al-Hamid planned to attend a private, invitation-only auction of antiquities hosted by a regime-connected businessman. Procuring an invitation for Alia was a delicate sub-operation, achieved by having one of her satisfied clients, a senior official in the Ministry of Culture, recommend her as an expert consultant to the auction house. Her role was legitimate, to authenticate and appraise several textile pieces on offer. At the auction, she did not approach the general directly. Instead, she allowed him to observe her. She engaged in a spirited but respectful debate with another expert over the provenance of a 12th-century Fatimid silk fragment, demonstrating a depth of knowledge that was both impressive and irrefutable. Her performance was calculated to appeal to Al-Hamid's intellectual arrogance. He was a man who respected expertise above all else. As planned, he approached her during a recess. Their initial conversation, as she later reported to her handler, was a cautious dance. He tested her knowledge with a series of esoteric questions about Sasanian weaving techniques and the use of Tyrian purple dye. She answered his questions with precision and then pivoted, asking about his own collection, displaying a carefully researched understanding of his specific interests. She had laid the bait. Over the next several months, she cultivated the connection through a series of carefully orchestrated, chance, encounters at galleries and cultural events. The relationship remained strictly professional, built on a foundation of mutual intellectual respect. The breakthrough came 6 months after their first meeting, when Al-Hamid, frustrated with the work of a previous restorer, invited Alia to his private villa to assess a damaged Seljuk prayer rug, one of the prize pieces in his collection. She had breached the fortress walls. The operation reached its climax on a humid Tuesday evening in May. Alia arrived at General Al-Hamid's heavily guarded villa in the affluent Meza district of Damascus. She carried her toolkit, a familiar sight to the general and his security detail. Inside, she was led to his private study, a room that served as both a library and a personal office, lined with bookshelves and display cases for his artifacts. This was the inner sanctum, the one location where Mossad believed the general felt secure enough to work on his most sensitive research notes outside the SSRC labs. While she worked on the prayer rug, making a show of meticulously documenting its condition and taking fiber samples, she guided the conversation towards the challenges of preservation. She spoke of the delicate balance of chemistry required to create stable, long-lasting conservation materials, a topic deliberately chosen to resonate with his own professional obsessions. The general, flattered by her interest and confident in his intellectual superiority, began to speak more freely about his own work, using veiled, allegorical language to boast of the elegance and permanence of his own chemical formulations. This was the psychological opening she had been trained to exploit. She asked for a glass of water, a simple request that caused him to leave the room for less than 2 minutes. In that brief window, every second of which had been rehearsed hundreds of times in simulations, her actions were a blur of fluid efficiency. She moved to his large mahogany desk, where a leather-bound notebook lay open. This was his current research journal, the primary target. Ignoring the book itself, she focused on the blotter pad beside it, a pristine sheet of absorbent paper he used to prevent smudging. From her toolkit, she removed the airbrush. With a single, silent press of the actuator, she released the invisible mist of the mantis compound onto the center of the blotter. The volatile solvent evaporated almost instantly, leaving behind the microscopic, crystalline residue of the catalytic agent. She returned to her workstation a full 30 seconds before the general returned with her water. The transfer mechanism was now in place. Al-Hamid's habit, documented by prior intelligence, was to use the blotter frequently. The contaminant would transfer from the paper to the skin of his hand, and from there to the edge of the pages in his notebook. When he next wore gloves in his laboratory and handled the notebook, the microscopic particles would transfer to the gloves, and from there, into the sensitive chemical precursors of common 7. It was an infection passed through inanimate objects, a chain of contamination that was utterly untraceable. There was no dramatic escape. The most critical phase of the extraction was the seamless continuation of her cover. Alia finished her assessment of the rug, provided the general with a detailed and professionally impeccable restoration proposal, accepted his payment, and left the villa. In the following weeks, she began the restoration work, interacting with the general several more times to provide updates. Her demeanor remained unchanged, professional, detached, and focused. Her mission was complete, but the operation was not over. She had to remain in place, a living, breathing component of the post-operational deception. Her planned extraction was scheduled for 6 months later, a timeframe calculated to be long after the sabotage had manifested and any subsequent investigation had reached a dead end. The waiting was the final test of her psychological endurance. She continued her life as Alia Sadiq, restoring art, attending cultural events, and communicating with her handler only through the established secure channels. Every day was a risk, every interaction a potential test. She was a ghost, hiding in plain sight, waiting for a signal that would allow her to finally come home. The consequences of Operation Damask Rose began to ripple through the Syrian weapons program 4 months after the act of sabotage. The first indications came from signals intelligence, which intercepted frantic communications between SSRC facilities describing batch integrity failures. A human source within the program's logistics chain later confirmed a series of bizarre and catastrophic incidents. Several batches of a key precursor chemical, valued at millions of dollars, were found to have become chemically inert, their molecular structure inexplicably altered. More alarmingly, during a test synthesis at a pilot production plant, a routine mixing procedure resulted in a violent exothermic reaction, causing an explosion and fire that killed 3 junior scientists and destroyed a significant portion of the specialized equipment. The accidents were inconsistent and unpredictable, defying analysis by Al-Hamid's frantic research team. The Common 7 program, once on the verge of success, ground to a halt, plagued by what appeared to be a fundamental and inexplicable flaw in its core chemistry. The program was not merely delayed, its scientific foundation was shattered. The invisible contaminant had done its work, turning the general's greatest achievement into a source of failure and death. The political and professional fallout for General Adnan al-Hamid was brutal and swift. In a paranoid regime built on a cult of personality and absolute competence, catastrophic failure could only be interpreted as either gross incompetence or treason. An investigation was launched by Syrian military intelligence, but with no evidence of an external attack or sabotage, their suspicion fell squarely on the project's leader. They tore apart his research, re-examined his formulas, and found only the inexplicable failures. His arrogance, once seen as a sign of his genius, was now reinterpreted as hubris that had led him to a fatal miscalculation. His foreign education and contacts, once a source of prestige, now made him a target of suspicion. 6 months after Alia Sadiq had walked out of his villa, General al-Hamid was quietly arrested. He was never publicly charged or tried. He simply vanished into the regime's gulag, his fate sealed. Months later, a terse, classified report concluded that he had either been a foreign agent who deliberately sabotaged his own work or a fraud whose scientific reputation had been vastly inflated. His name was erased from SSRC records, and the Common 7 program, now irrevocably associated with his disgrace, was indefinitely suspended, its surviving scientists reassigned and its resources diverted. Yael's extraction was executed with the same quiet professionalism as the rest of the operation. On a predetermined date, she closed her studio, informing her clients that she was traveling to Lebanon to source rare materials. She took a service taxi to the Lebanese border, crossed using her Argentinian passport, and was met on the other side by a Mossad team who spirited her away to a waiting ship. The psychological cost of the mission became apparent only after her return. During her debriefing, she struggled to shed the persona of Alia Sadiq. She found herself defaulting to Damascene Arabic, her posture and mannerisms still those of the reserved art restorer. The process of reintegrating her original identity was long and arduous, requiring extensive psychological support. She had lived a lie so completely that the truth had become foreign. The woman who had left Israel 3 years prior no longer existed, she had been replaced by a composite, a fusion of Yael Kaplan and Alia Sadiq, forever marked by the profound isolation and moral ambiguity of her work. The operation was hailed within Mossad as a textbook success, a triumph of patient, intelligence-led sabotage over brute force. It had neutralized a strategic threat without firing a shot or dropping a bomb, at an immense but invisible human cost. The woman at its center had saved countless lives by sacrificing her own singular identity, becoming a ghost in her own life, a permanent resident in the gray twilight of espionage. The ethical questions raised by the operation's methods lingered long after its conclusion. The sabotage had been designed to be subtle, but its consequences were not bloodless. The deaths of the 3 junior scientists in the lab explosion were a direct, albeit unintended, result of the contaminant's destabilizing effect. From a clinical, strategic perspective, their deaths were a small price to pay for the prevention of a chemical attack that could have killed thousands. This cold calculus is the foundational logic of intelligence work, a necessary framework for making impossible decisions. Yet, for the operative who set the events in motion, the distinction was less clear. Yael, or the person she had become, was forced to live with the knowledge that her actions, however justified by the larger strategic context, had led to the deaths of individuals who were likely little more than cogs in a machine, scientists following orders. Furthermore, the operation's success relied on the complete psychological manipulation and professional ruin of General Al-Hamid. He was not killed, but his identity, his life's work, and his very existence were systematically dismantled. This form of destruction, which leaves the body intact but erases the person, occupies a morally gray area that challenges the traditional definitions of warfare. It raises a fundamental question about the limits of acceptable action in the defense of a nation. Was the complete annihilation of a man's life and reputation, coupled with the collateral deaths of his subordinates, a justifiable price to pay for neutralizing a weapon of mass destruction? Can an action be considered righteous if its success is predicated on such profound and intimate deception? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel.